Okay, here we go. Welcome. It's nice to have you back. We're about to start the second chapter of Tanya. The second chapter of Tanya is where the revolutions begin. Up until now, what we did may have challenged some of our preconceptions, and that's a good thing. It's always good to be forced to confront things that you haven't necessarily confronted before, to think about things in a different way to how you normally think about them. So that's what we've started to do. And this evening, we're going to begin the real revolution. So, quick summary of what brought us up until this point. We started off the first chapter with a quotation from the Talmud that says that even before a person was born, each of us was made to take an oath. And it sounds a little bit unfair. You know, how do you get to take an oath about circumstances that you know absolutely nothing about? Those circumstances being the circumstances of life. You know, you don't know what it's going to be. You don't know what it's going to entail. And nevertheless, our sages tell us that before our souls entered this world, we were administered an oath, and we all took it. And we all signed up, and the oath was Tehi Tzaddik, guarantee that you will be a righteous individual, Ve'al Tehi Rasha, and equally that you will not be a wicked individual. And of course, there are a bunch of questions that immediately raise in our minds, like, why do you have to have the double expression? If you've already told me to be good, surely you don't have to tell me, and don't be bad. It sounds a little bit superfluous. And what does good and bad actually mean? What is a righteous individual? What is a wicked individual? In fact, that's probably the most important part of the conversation. You know, if you've undertaken to do something, you really want to know, what is it that I signed up for? So I said I'm going to be a tzaddik. Well, what is a tzaddik? And that led us into a conversation about the fact that there are effectively 5 categories of Jewish people. There is the perfect tzaddik, the most incredible human, the most incredible spiritual being. There is the not so perfect tzaddik. Now that sounds a little bit strange to us, and it's going to take us some time to work out how it's possible to be both a tzaddik, which is so incredible, and not perfect. We'll talk about that. We also discover that there, on the opposite end, is what we call an absolute rasha, which would mean an absolutely wicked person, and somebody who's wicked but not absolutely wicked. Okay, we've got to work out what that is. And one of the first things we'll do along our journey, I don't want to say first things, one of the important things we'll do along our journey is we'll get rid of that translation. We're going to stop translating rasha as some kind of terrible, wicked kind of a personality. It's a very important part of our progress. And then we're going to learn about what is called a Beinoni, which ostensibly is a person somewhere in the middle, kind of good, kind of bad, we're not exactly sure. And one of the first things that we did in chapter 1 was we dismissed the notion that a Beinoni is this halfway house. You know, a person who's not quite sure exactly where they belong. Are they a good person? Are they not such a good person? They kind of vacillate between good and evil. We're going to see that that's not how it works. And a Beinoni actually becomes an aspirational figure rather than just an average figure. But we'll still talk about that. Because the main thing that we came across in the first chapter was the introduction to the principle of 2 souls. That we are a dual cellular entity. Okay, that's what we are. Every single one of us, we have 2 souls inside of ourselves. And that's going to explain much of our conflict, our growth versus our failures. It's going to tell us everything that we need to know about ourselves, is to understand this tension that exists, firstly, because they're 2 souls, and then what the nature of the tension is between those 2 souls. Now, we don't know yet what the 2 souls are. By the end of the last chapter, we had only met one of those souls. And the one soul that we were introduced to was called the Nefesh HaChiyunis, which means that it's the battery pack for the human body. So you have to survive. And to survive doesn't just mean that you've got enough energy to run. To survive means you have to have a certain amount of intelligence, you have to have a certain amount of emotion, you have to have certain aptitudes, otherwise you can't survive. So this battery pack soul, the Nefesh HaChiyunis, which is responsible for our survival, is actually quite a complex creature. I mean, it is a soul after all. It's not just lithium. So this part of ourselves, this soul, this so-called Nefesh Chiyunis, animating, or as we'll subsequently get to call it, Nefesh HaBahamis, animal soul, that's the part of us that really just cares about me in the here and now, cares about making sure that I survive, that I'm entertained, that I feel good about myself, that I have healthy relationships. And so it could very easily be corrupted. And because it's impulsive by nature, it can very easily lead us to impulsive negative behavior, but at the same time, it's not all bad, and we came to the conclusion that this part of our soul is the part that allows us to be impulsively good as well. So if you are a naturally kind, generous, tolerant, forgiving kind of a person, that might just simply be your Nefesh HaChiyunis, your animating or animal soul. It's only this evening when we get to chapter 2 that we have the opportunity to meet the second soul. And once we get to learn about the second soul, which we'll do between chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5, so you'll be surprised. Why on earth do you call this your second soul? Isn't this your real you? And that's why this evening is introducing the real you. Or maybe we should say the real I. In other words, it's what sits at the core of who we are. And that's important. It's important for us to know that that is part 2 of the story, chapter 2. Because chapter 1 of the human story is how we meet the superficial self. Sadly, too many people stay with their superficial self, and that becomes who they are from start to finish, top to bottom. That's what their life is. Life is about the achievements that I make. Life is about the friends that I have. And these are good things. Don't get me wrong. They're valuable things. But if we think that that's all there is to life, just the part that can be noticed on the surface, and we don't know that we should be digging deeper, there's not just a chunk of ourselves that we miss. We get to miss the core of ourselves. And that's probably one of the most tragic things that could ever happen to a person, is to miss the opportunity to live with the reality of who I am at my core. So one of the things that we often talk about in Judaism, particularly in Hasidic teachings, we often talk about the principle of digging a well, right? Ever dug a well? A borehole. Okay, here we are in South Africa. Very often people want to have boreholes because that way you have uninterrupted water supply. So the goal of the borehole is that there's water down there somewhere. And you know that it's difficult to reach that water. And you know that it's going to take effort, and it's going to take noise, and it's going to take expense, and maybe initially you're going to go through soft sand and you're going to think, oh, I'm getting somewhere. And then the next thing you're going to hit hard rock, and you're going to have to drill through that rock, and it's going to feel like there's a tremendous amount of resistance. But eventually, if you keep on at it and you focus yourself and you do what you need to do, when you do find that water, it's so incredibly refreshing. It's exactly the same with us. Each of us, we need to create a well within ourselves. In other words, you identify that the me I look at when I look in the mirror, the me that I identify when I define myself by my occupation or by my talents or by my emotional state, my psychological well-being, all of that is the outer shell of self. And it's only chapter 2, the chapter that a person arrives at through focus, through guidance, through meditation, through study, through contemplation. When I arrive at that point, what I discover is not another piece of the puzzle. I don't find another asset that I have. I have intellectual assets and emotional assets and physical assets, and then I discover spiritual assets. That's not what it is. It's like that aha moment where suddenly everything comes to light. And now I see myself and my purpose and my interaction with each other, with other people. Every engagement in my life I see in a completely different way, because somebody's turned on the lights. Somebody has revealed what has lived beneath the surface for X amount of years of my life, and it's not another detail. It's literally like plugging in the entire system. All the pieces of the appliance were there, but it hadn't been powered up yet by the power source. So this is a very revelationary part of our experience of what we're going to learn this evening. So if I had to ask a person, and I did earlier this afternoon actually, I put it out on social media and I said, how would you describe your soul? It was interesting what came back. Some of the suggestions that came back were really interesting. So, people said the unconscious mind. People quoted. It's always interesting when people quote, because then you wonder, like, is this what you believe, or did you just fish a quote because you wanted to impress the rabbi? But it was interesting what people said. It's the deeper, pure element of self. Very interesting perceptions, and many of them are true. But what we're going to learn this evening, in the opening line of this chapter, is something that should totally shake us to the core of our being. And not to be irreverent, but for those of you who remember, and maybe it ages who's in the crowd, but if those of you remember the old NBS advert, do you remember that? The old NBS advert, right? How did it go? Come on into the NBS and get your slice. Remember that? Come and get your slice. Well, that's exactly what we're going to speak about this evening, how to get your slice. Not your slice of the pie, not your slice of success, but your slice of, well, let's see. So he tells us, "V'nefesh hashenis b'Yisrael." What does it mean to be a Jewish person? Is Judaism a religion, something which is heavily debated? Is it something which is a matter of culture? Is Judaism some kind of a club that we belong to? Is Judaism an ethnicity? So here he tells us, V'nefesh hashenis b'Yisrael. It is the nature of this unique soul that we're going to study this evening. That's what makes us Jewish. We're not Jewish just because we belong to a particular family or because we observe a particular set of traditions. We are Jewish by virtue of a very unique soul that we've been given. You know, we often throw around the term chosen people. We spoke about this a little bit last time. And people are offended by the notion of chosen people, as if we've done something, you know, as if we've laid claim to something. To be chosen means that you're given some element of life and of experience that isn't given wholesale to just about everybody. And with it comes a tremendous degree of responsibility. A tremendous degree of responsibility, as we said last week, that it's not good enough just to be a mensch anymore. Now you've got to discover a whole new way of living your life. So the heritage that we have, the Jewish heritage, when we stood at the foot of Sinai, and God said, V'yisim li am segula, you will be a treasured nation from amongst every populace on this earth. What happened at that point in time? This happened. V'nefesh hashenis b'Yisrael. That's what happened. We were then endowed with a second soul, a different soul to every other living creature that exists, and even every other human being that exists. Now, let's be clear. That doesn't give us license to behave in a way that's disparaging to anybody on this earth. The Torah teaches us very clearly that we are to respect every single one of Hashem's creations. That includes even non-human elements of creation, and certainly human. We know that the Torah has very strict laws about how we're supposed to treat the members of other communities. So this is not supposed to put us on a pedestal. This is supposed to tell us to celebrate a heritage that we have. What is the heritage? V'nefesh hashenis b'Yisrael. This second soul, which is the gift Hashem gave to the Jewish nation, hi chelek Eloka mimal mamesh. It is your slice. It's your slice of God from on high, mamish, literally. So we need to understand the words because they're very carefully chosen. The Alter Rebbe, the author of the Tanya, agonized at times for weeks before he decided exactly how he was going to word a particular sentence, and sometimes even spent weeks over a letter, should it have the conjunction and or not. So if he chose these words, these are really important words, and we need to focus and understand what they are. Chelek Eloka mima'al mamish. I think it's fair to say that any person who has had the privilege of learning Tanya will know those words. So what do they mean? Chelek means a piece. Eloka, God. So Chelek Eloka would mean a piece of God. Mima'al, from the highest level that exists. Mima'al means above that which is above. Mamish, literally. Now, the first three words are actually biblical. Chelek Eloka mimal is an expression that is used in the Tanakh, in the Bible, to describe the soul. Chelek Eloka mimal. It is a piece of God from on high. The Alter Rebbe adds here the word mamish, which means literally. And by adding that word, he tells us a tremendous amount about ourselves. But let's start at the beginning. Chelek. What do you mean a piece? How can you be a piece of God? Or, let's flip the question, isn't everything a piece of God? Surely. Isn't that how we see the world? Now, we're not pantheists, but don't we see that the world is, at the end of the day, godly energy that pulsates through every single fiber of every single particle at every single nanosecond? Yes. That does not mean that everything is a piece of God. For example, the Talmud tells us that one of the names, we have various names obviously that we use for Hashem, but one of the names that we use for Hashem is the word ha-mokoim. It's interesting. So for example, when a person, God forbid, is bereaved, and we go to wish them ha-mokoim yenachem eschem. Now it's a strange thing to try to translate into English, because if you want to translate it generically, you can just say, may God comfort you amongst the mourners of Zion in Jerusalem. But it's not a good translation, because the direct translation of ha-mokoim means the place. So the Talmudic sages ask, why would we call God the place? Why don't we call God the power? Why do we call God the source, the infinite, the great? I don't know. There's so many words that we could use, and we do use them. But why is it that we have this expression ha-mokoim? And we use it in very interesting places. Like, for example, when you're trying to comfort somebody who's bereaved. So the sages tell us it's to teach us Hu mekoimoi shel oilam ve'ein ha'oilam mekoimoi. It's to teach us that God is the space within which existence lives, and existence is not a space that accommodates him. In other words, we want to be very clear about something, and it's important we know this right from the beginning. Anything that exists at any level, spiritual, physical, great, small, infinite, fine, it doesn't matter. Anything that exists within God. There cannot be anything outside of Hashem. And nothing can contain or define God. That's why we say, Hu mekoimoi shel olam. He is the stage, he is the platform within which existence happens. Ve'ein ha'olam mekoimoi, and nothing about existence can be the space that defines him. In other words, yes, it's really important to acknowledge that everything comes from God and everything is energized by God and everything is recreated by God on an absolutely moment-to-moment basis. It's equally important to understand that that means nothing is a piece of God. What do you mean a piece of God? Well, what we're going to define in the course of this chapter is we're going to take this notion of a piece of God and we're going to take a spiritual magnifying glass and we're going to look at it more deeply and more deeply as we proceed through the chapter. So for now, let's keep it simple for now, because there's still layers to come. For now, what we mean is, Chelek Eloka means you're part of the Creator rather than a creation. Chelek Eloka. You're a part of God. You're a part of the Creator rather than a creation. Now that's a fundamental shift. This neshama, this soul that I have inside of myself, that really defines me for who I am as a Jewish person, because that's what we're saying. It's the nefesh hashenis b'Yisrael. This is what defines us as being Jewish. What is it? It's the point of intersection between me and the Creator. Now we're going to explain this concept in two significant ways, two different levels. One we'll already look at this evening, please God, and the other we'll only look at further on in the chapter. But it's an incredible thought before we proceed. We are chelek boire. We are a segment of the Creator, not chelek nivra, a segment of creation. That's the definition of my soul. That immediately means a whole lot of things. It means, for example, that I have the power to do things that may go against the grain of creation. So my nefesh ha-chiyunis, my animating soul, that's just a part of myself that is part of creation. So if it's part of creation, it does normal things and it conforms to normal rules. Like, for example, if you're a tiny, minuscule amount of people on the planet and over history, group after group wants to eradicate you, then if you're just an animating soul and that's your whole reality and you belong to creation, well, the laws of creation are survival of the fittest, and then you won't survive. But if you've got something intrinsic to who you are, that's part of the Creator is not bound by these laws of creation. So yes, there are a whole lot of reasons why we should not be here, and yet we'll be here. We'll defy all of the odds. It will influence our behavior, as we'll see later on in Tanya. It will influence us in a way that we behave irrationally for our Judaism. Like, for example, the story, I don't think it's a far-fetched story, I'm sure it happened at least once. The story of the secular Jew who has a big issue with the Haredi Jew. And they're having this whole fight on the streets, on the corner of, just outside Mea Shearim. And the secular Jew is like, you people are so primitive, and you don't behave properly, and you're super spreading the virus, and you won't get vaccinated, and you don't educate your children properly, and you don't know how to have family planning, and you don't hold down proper jobs, and you don't serve in the army, and you just leech off the community, like a whole thing. And while this is happening, an Arab comes past and swears at the Haredi Jew. And the secular guy goes and beats up the Arab. Right? Why? Because I'm irrational for my Judaism. I don't agree with a whole lot of things rationally. But don't touch my people. Don't touch my brother. It doesn't make any sense. I hate their guts. They don't pay taxes. But you don't touch, you don't lay a finger. Or the same Jewish person who says, I don't believe in anything, I don't believe there's a God, like the atheist who came out of the Holocaust and he said, after what I've been through, I'm absolutely convinced that there is no God whatsoever. And to prove that I believe there's no God, every single year, it's a true story, every single year this guy would sit down on Yom Kippur and have bacon and eggs. On Yom Kippur. And somebody came over to him at one point and said, well, clearly you do believe that there's a God. Because if you didn't believe there was a God, why would it have to be on Yom Kippur? It doesn't make any difference if there's no God, right? Have the bacon and eggs whenever you want. So this is this chelek Eloika. It's an intrinsic part of God that lives inside us at the core of who we are, and it becomes inescapable. It becomes who we are in reality, when the chips are down, when everything else falls by the wayside, when we don't necessarily know what makes sense anymore, and we don't necessarily feel what we want to feel anymore, and somehow this persistent element of self keeps magnetizing us back to our Jewish roots in spite of ourselves. Chelek Eloika. It's a piece of God. And yet, Mima'al Mamesh. Now, if you know Hebrew, you'll appreciate that Mima'al Mamesh are absolutely contradictory terms. Mima'al means something which is very elevated, very abstract, very ethereal, very spiritual. And Mamesh means tangible, something you can literally hold in your hands. Now, that's a paradox. You cannot be Mima'al and Mamesh. I'll give you an example. Some people are very into spirituality. You ever met people like this? Very into spirituality. They meditate and they study and they go on retreats and they have these periods of cleansing the body and only having certain types of minerals, whatever it is. Very spiritual people. Other people are very hedonistic. Everything is about the car you drive, the watch you wear, which restaurant you ate at. Do you know how to tell this particular nuance of the flavor and the infusion and ayin, and all these things. Put the two people together, they cannot really talk. They can make nice, but they cannot really talk. Because what this person values, mima'al, all these abstract spiritual things, the mamash person says, what are you talking about? How practically is it going to put money in the bank? Don't come with all your great high-level philosophies and mystical ideals. How are you going to feed your family? And the other person's going to say, and how are you going to protect your soul? And they're not talking the same language, it's cross purposes. Mimal and mamish, they don't go together. Yet that is the incredible paradox of the Jewish experience, if you think about it. The Jewish experience is mimal mamish. It's this weird, harmonious interaction between the loftiest, most spiritual things and tachlis. I think that's what most people just don't get about us. They don't understand. You know, people always ask, do Jews believe in reincarnation? You know, and I always wonder, like, what motivates that question besides curiosity? And it feels like, oh no, motivation, that's Eastern philosophy. That's very spiritual. Do Jews meditate? Oh no, meditation is for gurus. Why? Because they think that our religion is very tactile. You know, what's our religion? Shabbos comes in this week at 6:26. Not 25, not 27, 6:26. And soon it's going to be Pesach. I shouldn't say it. People get very nervous. Soon it's going to be Pesach, and what happens on Pesach? You have to lean to the left when you eat the matzah, and you have to have exactly the correct amount of matzah, and if you don't have it within the appropriate amount of time, that's a problem. And then before Pesach comes along, you start vacuuming the pockets of your children's clothing. It's very down, tactile, mamish. Where's the mimal? Come on, surely it's a spiritual time, the exodus from Egypt and everything that it represents, and breaking out of the mold. Tell me about that kind of stuff. What is the symbolism of Pharaoh? Let's sit down at a Pesach Seder and, close our eyes and meditate and think about our personal liberation experiences and how we could make the world a better place. And what's a real Frum Seder like? No, don't talk. You haven't eaten a kazayas of matzah yet, and there's a debate. Is it 26 grams or is it more than, and leaning to the left, and you have to have one kazayas or two kazayasim, and make sure you finish the cups of wine in one shot. You can't take a breath in the middle because you've got to drink the whole thing in one shot, and you've got to lean to the left, and then you've got to make sure that you finish the afikomen before midnight, and did you say all the things and all that? Are we mima'al or are we mamish? Are we people who live in this great, incredible spiritual reality, or are we people who are tachlis? How long is the string of my tzitzis? Did the two straps of my tefillin touch while I was wearing them? Mima'al mamish is the paradox and the harmony of being Jewish. This soul of ours, in spite of the fact that it's not part of this world, it is a piece of the Creator. So it's mimal, that means to say that it is above everything that creation entails. Even the most spiritual dimensions of creation. And trust me, there are very spiritual dimensions of creation. There are very lofty spiritual realms that we don't even begin to know how to describe. And the soul is mima'al above that, above the greatest angels, above the greatest intellects, above the seraphim and the oifanim and the chayas hakodesh and the world of Atzilus and any other smart-sounding mystical term that you might want to throw around to show that you know what you're talking about. It's mima'al, it's beyond all of that. And yet, mamash, the soul can have a real impact on the physical world that we live in. And if you think that that's contradictory, it's not at all actually. Because we have a simple mystical principle that says the higher something is, the deeper it can impact. And that's not deep philosophy, it's practical. Here's a simple way to understand it. Who has a better chance of explaining astrophysics to a first grade class? A student who is a first year astrophysics student, or the world leading astrophysicist? Who has a better chance of speaking to that first grade class? I know what you're going to think. You're going to say, for sure, the youngster, right? That's what you expect. A youngster speaks the language, knows the jargon, knows the lingo, can connect with the kids. That's true. The youngster can connect with the kids, but probably doesn't know enough about astrophysics to actually tell them what they needed to be told. And it's quite possible that you've got this world-renowned professor of astrophysics that he'll just talk right over the heads not only of a first grade class, but even after the first year, over the heads of the first year astrophysics class. When you have a real genius who understands things at the essence, who really, really gets a concept, when you really get a concept, you can explain it to anybody. I don't know if it's true, but they claim that Einstein used to say, if you truly understand something, you'd be able to explain it to your grandmother. The higher something is, mima'al, the more it's connected to the essence of things, the more it can reach and impact mamash, a lowly, simplistic reality like planet Earth. And that's the paradox of being Jewish. So to understand the nature of our neshama, there are two things we have to understand. It links into the deepest source and therefore is relevant in the most basic reality of our world. We're not a religion that says you run away from the world to pursue spirituality. We're a religion that says you find the mima'al in the mamash. That there's this incredible portal between the highest of the high and the lowest of the low, and actually my soul is that portal. When my soul engages a human physical activity, it creates an opportunity to link that physical activity to the highest levels of godliness. So this is a really, really important concept for us to understand about the soul of ours. What sits at the core of who I am? A spiritual wormhole between physical earth and God himself. That's what it means to be Jewish. Perhaps an illustration of this might be, when our forefather Yaakov had that wrestling match all through the night with his mysterious assailant that, according to many opinions, was the guardian angel of the Edomite kingdom, which is his brother's kingdom. So his name, in the morning, he says to this being, "Bless me before you go." So he says, what's your name? He says, my name is Yaakov. He says, your name will no longer be Yaakov. Your name will be Yisrael, which becomes the collective noun of the Jewish people, Israel. Why Israel? Because you wrestled spiritual beings and human beings, and you overcame both. Mima'al mamish. To be part of Israel, to be part of this collective term called Israel, represented by our forefather Israel, is to successfully know how to both control the spiritual and the physical, how to bring them into harmony. As it stands, the way Hashem created His world, the physical reality and the spiritual reality are millions of miles apart. And we're the bridge. That's what it means to be Jewish. That's why Judaism takes the most lofty concepts and translates them into the most practical terms. That's why you cannot be a good Jew if you're floating around in the spiritual realm and you don't actually do what the Torah expects, nor can you be a good Jew if you're just doing what the world expects without plugging it back into God. So that's our first glimpse into the soul of ours. Let's look at some primary sources and see what does it mean and what language do we have in the Torah to describe it. So the first bit of language we have is Kamosha Kosuv, as the Torah tells us in the account of the creation of Adam, Vayipach bi'apov nishmas chaim. So it says that when God created Adam, God blew into his nostrils the soul of life. Okay, so we've already seen that there's something called nefesh habasar, the soul of the flesh. There the word was nefesh, which always connotes the lowest kind of soul. And now we see that there's another dimension that is offered to Adam. Adam is a prototype human. And Adam is the only human who was fashioned by God's own hand. So he's a perfect human. And Adam is the container of all future humans that will ever emerge. So the different dimensions of Adam's reality translate into the different dimensions of humanity. This nishmas chayim, the soul of life, that's the unique part of Adam that translated later into the soul you and I have, the unique Jewish soul. So what does the Torah tell us? Vayipach bi'apov, that Hashem blew that soul into his nostrils. We echo that every single morning in our early morning prayers, where we say, Elokai, and before we read what's inside, I'll give you the background. Elokai, my God, neshama shenosato, be the soul that you have placed inside of me, tohorahi, it is pure. Out of arasa, you created it. Out of yotzarto, you fashioned it. Ve'ato nofachto bi. We say the same thing. We say that Hashem, you blew that soul into me. Every single morning we acknowledge this. That I have this unique soul that is tohira, that is pure, and you blew it into me. Now what's the significance of blowing? So the Zohar, which of course is the classic work of Jewish mysticism, teaches us, Man de nofach, mitoichei nofach. When a person blows, it's an exercise that comes from deep inside the person's anatomy. Pirosh mitoichi yusoi u mipnimi yusoi. That means to say that when a person blows, it's something that doesn't only come from deep inside their diaphragm, but it actually comes from deep inside their person. Because it's a far deeper dimension of a person's energy and life that they expel when they blow. Let's understand what's going on over here. Obviously, the Torah chooses its metaphors really carefully. And if the Torah chose to use the metaphor of blowing a soul as the way to illustrate how souls get into us, we need to examine that metaphor. And we need to contextualize it. So let's contextualize it first. This is the story of creation. By the time we arrive at Adam, there have already been 6 days of creation, in which time Hashem has made everything from infinite light to planets in the universe to the schedule of time to creatures to angels. And now he eventually arrives at the point where he makes man. And this is the first time we come across the word nofach, vayipach be'apov, that Hashem blows something into existence. And the reason that's significant, again, you've got to put it in context. The reason that's significant is because if you go back to the other 6 days of creation, including the sixth day, everything that happened before Adam was created, you will hear the same theme repeated. Vayomer Elokim. And God said, let there be light. And God said, let the firmament separate from the lower waters. And God said, let the earth give forth all manner of vegetation, and so on. So we've now got two things to compare to each other. We've got the mechanics of speaking versus the mechanics of blowing. So let's make a comparison. What's the difference between them? How long can you talk? It's an unfair question, right? Depends who. And it depends who you're talking to. But let's say that you're having a conversation. A very relaxed, casual conversation. Could be face-to-face. It could be on the phone. And you talk and you talk and you talk and you don't even realize the passage of time. Before you know it, you've been speaking to the person for an hour. You don't even realize it. You could even speak to the person for 2 hours and you would not necessarily realize it. That's the unusual thing about talking, is that you can talk and talk, assuming, of course, you have something to talk about. If you have nothing to talk about, it's the most exhausting experience ever, right? Trying to have a conversation. But if you have something to talk about, if there's a person who you connect with and it's a person you're happy to talk and it goes smoothly, you can talk and there's no issue. There's no exhaustion that comes from talking. Now, what happens if instead of talking, you were blowing balloons for the same period of time? It's not going to be the same period of time. You cannot blow balloons for a fraction of the amount of time that you could talk. Why is that? Because to blow balloons, you've got to exhale. You know, it's like you can feel like your kishkas are coming out. You start to see stars. You know, you get a bit lightheaded. You've got to be careful. You know, a person blows balloons too many in a row. You could start to hyperventilate. You could start to deprive yourself of oxygen. I don't know. It's not a good idea. So that's why we use this metaphorically to imply something which takes energy and effort. You can feel like your insides are coming out when you're blowing as opposed to when you speak. So the fact that the Torah juxtaposes those realities, the reality of the whole of creation up until that point, and then the creation of Adam, by saying speaking versus blowing, you know what the Torah is showing us there? The amount of effort and investment that Hashem required in order to create everything is absolutely minimal. Absolutely minimal. Just like when you speak, it's not just that it doesn't require a lot of energy to speak. It's not just that. It's possible for a person to talk and they actually are not really investing themselves in the experience. You know, maybe when you learn, then every sentence that you say is meaningful and it carries a lot of content and it's powerful. But when you just chat, it's possible that you could talk and talk and talk and you're not even giving anything of yourself. Have you ever made conversation? You know that expression, make conversation? What does it mean to make conversation? It basically means, look, you know, we'll talk. I don't really want to be here, but I have to pass the time. You know, we're stuck sitting next to each other on a plane and you started talking to me, so I'm going to talk back. It's like one of my greatest pet peeves, right? When you sit down on a plane and you can relax or whatever. Somebody says, oh, tell me, you look like a rabbi. Oh, last thing I wanted. Anyhow, so what happens? You could talk and talk and talk and you can reveal nothing about who you really are. It's a fascinating thing. It's possible. In fact, it's possible for a person to talk and dafka to speak in such a way that will hide who they are. That could hide what you think and it could hide what you feel. That's pretty much what politicians do, right? They talk because they have to tell you what they believe you want to hear. In the meantime, they don't tell you what they really feel, what they really believe, or whatever. Okay, as long as they make you happy. So speaking implies an element of engagement that's actually very superficial, even though it's the main way that we have to engage meaningfully with people is through speaking. But it is possible for speaking to be very superficial. Here's another example. You give instructions. So give instructions. Do me a favor, could you move that box from the left corner of the room to the right corner of the room? Well, now I know who you are. Now I know what you believe in life. Now I know what you feel. No, you gave an instruction. Move the box from here to there. You haven't invested yourself in the experience. So when Hashem says, let there be light, what it's telling us is how much godliness is invested in making light the very most superficial level. As much as it would take any of us to give a single instruction. Please take out the garbage. Let there be light. It's like the same degree of investment. And that's what creation is. Creation to us is so impressive. To us, it's this incredible universe that we'll be exploring for who knows how many generations, and we won't begin to scratch the surface. And that's outward. And then if we go inward and we try and understand what's going on a subatomic level, the same concept will take us generations, and we won't begin to scratch the surface. And then you hear the oceanographers telling us that there is more that we know about the moon than what lives in our oceans. And you realize, wow, to us, that is incredibly impressive. But to Hashem, it's literally a few instructions that he gave compared to what Hashem is capable of. Try work it out. Try work out the value of a few sentences, 10 actually, because it's 10 utterances that Hashem used to create the world. Try take the value of 10 instructive sentences that you've used in your life and see if that gives the slightest glimpse into what your life is all about or what you're all about. And therefore the Torah says when it comes to the creation of the neshama, Hashem doesn't say, let there be a soul. He says, let there be a form, a human form. He says, let the earth produce a human form. That he says, because the body is part of creation. And together with the body is the animating force of the body. Just like when he created animals, they had an animating force that is calibrated to allow them to do what they have to do, to allow them the sophistication that they need in order to survive. So when God says, let there be the human form, at the same time the implication is, and let there be the battery pack that is going to power that human form with all of the things that it needs, the first soul. The first soul is created. It takes as much divine investment as it takes to make an ant or an amoeba or an atom. But to make a neshama, the real soul, the depth and essence of who we are, there the Torah changes the metaphor and says, Vayipach. Hashem blows. Now obviously Hashem doesn't speak, nor does he blow. It's all metaphoric. But we can identify with a metaphor. And we can identify the difference between when you're just speaking or when you're breathing, when you're resuscitating somebody with the kiss of life. You can tell the difference. You could tell that metaphorically the one calls on some kind of real investment of self. And that's what the Torah wants us to know. Nishmas Chayim. The fact that we were given this unique soul, that is not just a soul that was given to us. It's where Hashem reached, so to speak, deep into who he is, and he implanted some of that in us. Chelek Eloika. The definition of the soul is it's a piece of God. It's a part of God. Mima'al, that comes from the highest possible place. Mamash, literally living inside my physical reality. One last point just to round it off. Imagine if I showed you a picture. A picture, you know, you get those pictures, they're very emotive. You get those pictures of, let's say, a mother's finger with a newborn holding onto the finger. You know what kind of picture I'm talking about. So if I showed you that picture and I would ask you, which of the following sentences is correct? Option number 1, the newborn baby is holding its mother's finger. Option number 2, the mother's finger is being held by the newborn baby. Option number 3, the newborn baby is holding the mother's heart. Interesting, right? Now, technically all of them are correct. But the third option tells me that there's much more to the story. That when a mother is being clutched by her baby, when that baby holds on with that impulsive grip onto her finger, that is not, oh, the baby's holding part of me. The baby's holding all of me. When we say that there's a chelek, a part of God that lives inside of us, we're not saying you chop Hashem up into finite pieces and you get a piece and you get a piece and you get a piece. What we mean to say is every single one of us has this connection point that goes to the whole essence of Hashem, and that connection point lives inside us. That is the spiritual equivalent of me being the baby with my hand around God's finger. Except that the finger's not outside of me, it's at the essence of who I am. So to illustrate that better, he's going to give us, that was the first metaphor, the metaphor of blowing life. And to illustrate it better, in the rest of the chapter, he's going to develop a very powerful metaphor that is far more complex than the metaphor of just blowing. And thank God, because we have scientific knowledge, I believe that we today get to understand this metaphor even more keenly than they could have understood it in previous generations. So that, please God, is what we'll look at next week, the second deeper layer to this concept of a piece of Hashem that lives inside of us.